Now back to CBS News in New York.
For a look at the beginning of President Kennedy's day in Texas, a day that began without even a hint of disaster. Here from Dallas is CBS News correspondent Dan Rather.
President Kennedy's final 4 hours began this morning at Fort Worth's Carswell Air Force Base. He and Mrs. Kennedy had just attended a breakfast of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. At the airport in Fort Worth, before taking off for Dallas, the Kennedys, as they have been prone to do all along on this Texas trip, went to the fence railing to shake hands with well-wishers and to allow some pictures to be taken. The President and Mrs. Kennedy both had looked particularly refreshed and rested yesterday during their trip to San Antonio and Houston, and again this morning as they started to leave Fort Worth. Democratic congressmen accompanying the President on his trip were right behind him and Mrs. Kennedy. And the two boarded Air Force One at Carswell Air Force Base for the 30-mile air trip from Fort Worth to Dallas. It had been a rather gray morning a little bit earlier in the day as a cold front moved across Texas, and there had been some rain. Laden skies and that little bit of rain were giving way to brilliant sunshine just about, an hour before the President's scheduled arrival time at Dallas's Love Field. This was the crowd at Love Field, a particularly large greeting crowd. It was described that way by Dallas police and Mayor Earl Cabell. It's ironic that the rain stopped before the President's arrival in Dallas. Had it continued raining, a bulletproof bubble top which fits over the sleek presidential convertible would have undoubtedly been used today and possibly would have prevented the assassination. But as the sunshine broke through, President and Mrs. Kennedy arrived in Dallas to be greeted by a line of local dignitaries. A very enthusiastic crowd was on hand. Local reporters who've covered many of these gatherings called it one of the largest airport greetings in Dallas history. Mrs. Kennedy was given a bouquet of roses. Mrs. Kennedy seemed to enjoy shaking hands with the local populace a bit more today than she did yesterday in San Antonio and Houston, when there were times yesterday when Mrs. Kennedy appeared to be a little ill at ease. This morning she was all smiles and very warm in her greetings, as was the President. Of course, the President used to such occasions. The President spent what seemed to be a rather long time at the Dallas airport making sure that he shook hands with everyone who was on hand there. As far as the dignitaries were concerned, always taking time, of course, to introduce his wife. Because of the rather long time spent at the airport, the President was a bit late at getting started on his motorcade through downtown Dallas. They took time out at the airport to greet an elderly lady who said she had lived 69 years without shaking hands with the President. She got her chance today. The Secret Service, all during this Texas trip, had been allowing photographers and newsmen, local press, as distinguished from the White House news contingent, to work very closely around the President and Mrs. Kennedy. The presidential couple went again to the fence railing in Dallas to greet the well-wishers, departing from the course marked out for them by Secret Service people. But of course, President Kennedy had made something of a reputation as a man who liked to break away and shake hands with well-wishers and the crowds who gathered to see him. These are some of the last close-up pictures taken of President Kennedy. He was literally mobbed as he and Mrs. Kennedy went to that fence railing at Love Field. The crowd at the Dallas airport was, to a large measure, a young crowd. The teenage group which played such a prominent role in President Kennedy's 1960 campaign. Youngsters of the teen age were very much in abundance at the airport. Mrs. Kennedy carried with her the entire time at the airport the roses that had been given to her. Then the presidential couple entered the open Lincoln convertible in which they rode with Governor and Mrs. John Connally. Of course, Governor Connally also was shot in the convertible. In the convertible, 2 Secret Service agents driving it. Immediately behind them, Governor and Mrs. John Connally of Texas. And then in the rear seat, the President and Mrs. Kennedy. The plan in Dallas was to go from the airport with a rather slow motorcade so that everyone would have a chance to look, applaud, and take pictures of the President and Mrs. Kennedy. To go along Lemon Street, which is one of Dallas's main streets, then cut over to Main Street, and go down to Main Street after circling through the downtown area out to the Trade Mart, where the President was due to make a speech. This is the convertible which the President was riding when he was shot. Now, this is one of the overhead walkways and railroad trestles under which the presidential car had to go. At first, it was thought that the assassin's bullet might have been fired from one of those walkways or railroad trestles. But the current most popular theory is that the assassin's bullet was fired from the upper story of a building. This was the scene in downtown Dallas as the presidential motorcade went rather slowly by. As you can see, the crowd is 10, 12, and 14 lines deep. It was variously estimated that between 200 and 300,000 persons had turned out to greet President Kennedy. Down the Main Street Canyon of Dallas, the President riding in an open-top convertible, he and Mrs. Kennedy frequently looking up to wave to persons who took positions in the high buildings. As you can see, the welcome was enthusiastic and warm. It was from this kind of window that the assassin's bullet is believed to have been fired, although these particular pictures are further downtown than the scene where the actual shooting took place. Then the shots rang out. The presidential motorcade speeded up. The president was rushed immediately to Parkland Hospital. This is the rear entrance to the hospital through which the president's car was brought. There are the roses Mrs. Kennedy had been carrying. They were on the floor. They had gotten there in the car as Mrs. Kennedy put the head of her mortally wounded husband on her lap. This is the interior of the convertible. Dallas law enforcement officers and Secret Service men, along with Congressman Jim Wright, Democratic Senator Ralph Yarborough, were all on hand at the rear of the hospital. The law enforcement people and the Secret Service men kept photographers, newsmen, and the curious as far away from the rear of the hospital as they possibly could. Congressman Wright there in a moment of grief. A large crowd gathered at Parkland Hospital as word spread that the president had been shot. There was considerable disbelief at first that he had actually been shot. Some thought he simply had taken ill. This is the new and modern Parkland Hospital with some of the best facilities in this part of the country, to which the president was taken after he was shot. This is the ambulance that carried the president in, moving away. A tight security guard was placed around the automobile. There are some of the aides and 1 or 2 doctors, I believe, rushing into the hospital. Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was one of the last to see President Kennedy arrive, gave reporters some early details. These were long moments at Parkland Hospital as everyone waited for word on how is the president. Hospital sources gave this report of the arrival at the emergency entrance to the hospital, and I quote from the hospital: "The president was lying motionless in the car. Mrs. Kennedy was leaning over him, holding him. Governor Connally was leaning back in the seat, holding his stomach. Both men were covered with blood. Inside the emergency room, witnesses said the First Lady, splattered with blood, entered without a word." Mrs. Kennedy reportedly held up very well inside. She was heard only to say, "Jack, Jack, no, no." Even regular hospital attendants were barred admittance to the emergency room as a bevy of doctors worked frantically over President Kennedy. At the same time this scene was going on at Parkland Hospital, all around town, police, sheriff's deputies, and Secret Service men were following every possible lead, every possible clue in an effort to come up with some kind of lead to the assassin. Governor Yarborough, after checking inside in the emergency room, came out and told reporters that he simply didn't know whether the president was still alive or not. The Washington press corps and newsmen in general were, of course, pressing for some kind of word, some kind of detail. Things began to get crowded despite police efforts there at the rear of the hospital, the emergency room. At the moment these pictures were taken, it was known that the president was in serious, perhaps critical condition. It was not known that he was dead. All around the hospital, the faces of the crowd that gathered told the story. This is part of the motor entourage which I believe brought 2 Roman Catholic Church priests to the hospital. The crowd now has gotten the word. The word has been received that President Kennedy is dead. There were some others wounded at the scene of the shooting. They were brought in much later. Very shortly after it was announced that the president had died, a local ambulance pulled up to the hospital, and about the time it did arrive to carry the body of President Kennedy away, Presidential Press Assistant Malcolm Kilduff held a press briefing and made the announcement that the president was officially dead. He also explained the seating arrangement in the automobile in which the president had taken part in the motorcade along with Governor and Mrs. John Connally. This was a seating arrangement, the Secret Service, 2 Secret Service men in front, the Connollys in the middle, President and Mrs. Kennedy in the rear. President Kennedy was sitting on the right-hand side as you looked onto that car from the top side. The shot apparently was fired from about 1 block away from what is believed to have been a .30 caliber weapon. The crowd outside the hospital got larger about the time the presidential party and the body of President Kennedy left Dallas's Parkland Hospital. Police continued to stand guard over the convertible which had brought the blood-splattered Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Connally to the hospital. The latest word on Governor Connally is that he is in serious but not critical condition. Here it is being explained to some members of the crowd that they have to get further back. Here are some grief-stricken members of the presidential party. Mrs. Kennedy rode out in an ambulance. The curtains drawn. The body was taken immediately to Dallas's Love Field, where it was put aboard the presidential plane, Presidential One. Here is the Roman Catholic father who administered the last rites, Oscar Huber, Father Oscar Huber of Holy Trinity Church in Dallas and one of the other fathers at Holy Trinity Church. They were the two Catholic priests who administered the last rites. There were stares of disbelief as the body of the president rode away. All afternoon, many Dallasites kept saying it just can't be true. Mayor Earl Cabell as he rushed away from the hospital. President's personal secretary and Mrs. Kennedy's secretary leaving the hospital at about the time the body left. The ambulance that carried the body of President Kennedy out to the airport. The motorcade, of course, was very small. The ambulance, 3 cars, and some police motorcycle escorts. It was a bronze coffin in which the body of the president was placed inside that ambulance. Police, in the meantime, had ringed a building from which the shots were believed to have been fired. This is the building about a block from Houston and Maine in Dallas. Police had heard reports that a man with a gun had been seen on the 4th or 5th floor of that building, so they immediately circled the building, heavily armed police and sheriff's deputies, and an inch-by-inch, foot-by-foot search was made of the building and also of the surrounding neighborhood. A number of suspects were picked up in the early minutes after the shooting. Some of those picked up were simply people officers thought might have some information on the shooting, not people that the police thought actually did the shooting. For about a half an hour, law enforcement officers thought they might have the assassin trapped in the building. One employee of the building was later picked up as a suspect and is still in custody. At the time these pictures were filmed, the police thought they might have the assassin still inside that building. As mentioned earlier, not only the building, but a 3 or 4 block area was sealed off. From one of those open windows, perhaps came the shot that killed President Kennedy. At least 6 and possibly as many as 12 arrests were made in the confusion and frantic searching that followed the shooting. This warehouse building is located a block from the Houston and Maine intersection where the president was shot. This is the motorcade route area. This is the kind of neighborhood in which the shooting occurred. Police and detectives here are chasing some other people that they wanted for questioning in connection with the shooting. Then downtown at a theater, police arrested a man after a Dallas policeman was shot. The man was brought immediately to police headquarters, as were all of those arrested. That man said to have been an employee of the building from which the shot is believed to have come. Let me emphasize that no charges have been filed against anyone in connection with the case. This is Judge Sarah T. Hughes, a woman federal district judge. She is the woman who gave the oath of office to now President Lyndon Johnson after the shooting of President Kennedy. Judge Sarah T. Hughes here is going directly to the plane at Love Field where the presidential oath was administered to Lyndon Johnson. This is the plane carrying the body of President Kennedy from Dallas to Washington. The final speech of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was made this morning to a breakfast meeting of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. This was that speech.
The United States.
I know now why everyone in Texas, Fort Worth, is so thin, having gotten up and down about 9 times. This is what you do every morning. Mr. Buck, Mr. Vice President, Governor Conley, Senator Yarborough, Jim Wright, members of the congressional delegation, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Attorney General, ladies and gentlemen. 2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear, but